On February 24th, 1978, 5 young men left Yuba City in Northern California for what should have been an ordinary night. A college basketball game, a short drive home, and plans for the next morning they'd been looking forward to for weeks. But they never made it home. Days later, their car would be found hours away, headed in the opposite direction of home. Months later, 4 of them were discovered miles from where they should have been, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, beyond the snow line. The 5th was never found. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Darkly Speaking. I'm your host, Alex Kern, and tonight, we're going back to 1978 to walk through one of the most unsettling unsolved mysteries in the U.S. This case is often compared to the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, where 9 hikers vanished in the northern Ural mountains of Soviet Russia and were later found scattered across the mountainside. I actually covered that story in a 2-part series in episodes 16 and 17, and many consider this the American counterpart due to the striking and eerie parallels. Because this story echoes the same perplexing and unexplained nature of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. In this case, a group of young men disappear into a snow-covered mountain landscape, their vehicle left behind, and the evidence fragmented and difficult to make sense of. 4 of them are eventually found, one having survived for weeks in a remote trailer, while one is never recovered. Their names were Gary Mathias, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, known to many as Jackie, Ted Wire, and Jack Madruga. And their disappearance would become one of the most disturbing death investigations in California history, now known as the Yuba County 5. In 1978, Northern California became the setting for what would grow into one of America's most enduring mysteries. It begins in Yuba County, 644 square miles along the western slopes of the northern Sierra Nevada mountains, due south of Butte County and southwest of Plumas County, home to the vast Plumas National Forest. The group of 5 young men were often referred to as the boys, not because they were children, but because their disabilities were widely misunderstood, especially in the late 1970s. And the media, along with parts of the community, framed them in that way. It was a label shaped by perception as much as protection. Each of them had disabilities or mental health needs, and while their families used that language with affection, much of the public reporting reduced them to a simplified version of themselves, overlooking that they were adult men with complex lives. Now, it's important to clarify something that reporting at the time often blurred together. The modern term we use today is intellectual disability, language that replaced older, now archaic terminology once used to describe lower IQ levels. Under the DSM-5, mild intellectual disability generally refers to an IQ between 50 and 69. But not all 5 men fell into that category. Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, and Bill Sterling were described as having mild intellectual disabilities, while Jackie Hewitt was more severely impaired with an IQ believed to be in the 40s. Gary Mathias, on the other hand, didn't have an intellectual disability. He had average intelligence and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, which at the time was often referred to as paranoid schizophrenia, a term that is no longer formally used or recognized. Today, schizophrenia is understood as a complex psychiatric disorder that exists on a spectrum and can involve symptoms of psychosis, meaning periods where a person may struggle to distinguish what is real versus what is not. All 5 men were enrolled in an adult day program connected to Gateway Projects. The organization provided enrichment activities for adults with disabilities, as well as job training and assistance with employment. At the time, employment among individuals with mild intellectual disabilities was cited around 80%. In their community, they were a familiar unit, and 2 main things bound them tightly together. The first was their shared reality of disability or mental health needs. Intellectual disability for several, schizophrenia for Gary. The second was basketball. They played on a team together called the Gateway Gators, which is a part of the program. On February 25th, they were actually scheduled to compete in a Special Olympics-style tournament made up of teams with special needs players. If they won, the prize was enormous to them: a week-long trip to LA to spend time with the cast of All in the Family, which is a sitcom in the 70s. All 5 of them lived at home with their families, physically healthy and capable and generally high-functioning, though none lived fully independently. Ted Wire was 32 years old and the oldest of the group. He had a mild intellectual disability and had worked in the past as a janitor and a snack bar clerk, though he didn't have a job at the time of the story. He was described as having a heart of gold. He loved making new friends, and there was something openly childlike about him. Cynthia Gorney wrote in a 1978 Washington Post piece that Ted would wave to strangers and be heartbroken for hours if they didn't wave back. He also struggled with practical judgment in ways that could have serious consequences. There were moments that illustrated this clearly. For example, he once spent $100 on pencils, nearly $600 in today's terms, without any real reason. On another occasion, during a house fire, he remained in bed while the home was actively burning, explaining later that he was tired and needed to be up for work. He didn't always recognize danger in the way others might, and his instincts for self-preservation were limited. And Ted was especially close to Jackie. Jack Hewitt, aka Jackie, was 24, the youngest and most severely disabled. His IQ was believed to be in the 40s, and he had spent most of his childhood at Napa State Hospital, then known as Napa Insane Asylum. He couldn't read, write, or dial a telephone. His calls were extremely short. He simply said what he needed to say and then hung up. Even with his girlfriend, he often barely spoke, just mostly listening. According to his parents, he struggled to comprehend the idea of speaking to someone who wasn't physically present through a receiver. He was shy and didn't like being away from home for long stretches, and definitely not overnight, which is why his parents would later be especially worried. He relied heavily on his mother and Ted. People often described him as Ted's shadow, going wherever Ted went. Jack Madruga was 30 years old, and although he lived at home, he was relatively independent and worked as a dishwasher at Sunsweet Growers. Though not formally diagnosed, he was described as slow, meaning he took longer to learn tasks or concepts. But once he understood something, he performed it very well. He had served in the Army from 1966 to 1968 as a truck driver and was one of the only 2 men in the group with a valid driver's license, the other being Gary. He could handle his own banking, and he even owned a car that took the group to Chico that night, a turquoise and white Mercury Montego, his pride and joy. Bill Sterling was 29. He had a mild intellectual disability and had trouble holding down a steady job. In 1978, he wasn't actively working and received a $15 weekly allowance from his parents. He strongly disliked being outdoors. He didn't like the cold. He didn't like the woods. He simply preferred staying inside at home. He had previously worked as a dishwasher, but his mother insisted he quit after learning coworkers were taking advantage of him and stealing his money. Lastly, there's Gary Mathias. He was a 25-year-old Army veteran who had been stationed in West Germany in the early 1970s. By 1978, he was living with his parents in Marysville because of schizophrenia, a condition that, at that point, was well managed. His instability had surfaced years earlier, though. After struggling with drug use in high school, he was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and discharged from the military in 1973. Now, to be clear, schizophrenia is not caused by drug use, though drugs can certainly intensify its symptoms, something that complicated his early years. But by 1978, he had been stable for about 2 years. He never missed his daily doses of medication, which addressed the psychological symptoms of the disorder: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, abnormal movements, difficulty functioning, and helped manage the medication's physical side effects such as involuntary movements and twitching, and was known to improve focus. At the time, he was by all accounts doing great. He was working for his father's gardening business, he had rebuilt a social life, he went out with friends, drank socially, and seemed in many ways like the young man he had been before his diagnosis. No one is entirely sure how he first became involved with Gateway projects, but what is clear is that he loved it, especially the Gators. He truly valued being a part of the group. On February 24th, 1978, the night before the tournament, The group was buzzing with anticipation. Their excitement showed up in small ways in the week leading up to their tournament. Gary bugged his mother all week to make sure everything would run on schedule. Ted obsessed over keeping his brand new high-top sneakers in perfect condition for the game. Some of the guys even already had their uniforms cleaned and laid out on their beds, ready to go days before. That night, the group had plans to attend a college basketball game at Chico State. The Chico State Wildcats versus the UC Davis Aggies. The Aggies were their favorite team. They left Yuba City around 5:30 p.m., driving about an hour to Chico. They watched the game and had a great time. Their team won, and afterward, just before 10 p.m., they stopped at Bears Market in Chico, California. If they left Bears Market in Chico around 10 p.m., they should have been back in Yuba City at around 11 p.m., riding along a familiar route Jack Madruga had taken dozens of times in his Montego. Instead, as the early hours of February 25th settled in, families began waking, expecting to hear the usual sounds of someone coming home late. But what they found instead were empty bedrooms. One phone call led to another until a single shared realization emerged across households. None of the five had come home. It's the early morning hours of Saturday, February 25th, when Juanita Sterling wakes up at around 2 a.m. with the uneasy sense that something was off. Her son Bill still wasn't home from the basketball game. It's strange because he should have been home hours ago. She tries to steady herself with ordinary explanations. Maybe they stopped somewhere after the game, maybe the car had trouble, but the feeling wouldn't settle, so she called Mrs. Madruga to see if Jack had made it back, but he wasn't home either. By 5 a.m., the worry had spread. Imogen Wire woke with a sudden, unshakable feeling of her own. Her son Ted had traveled roughly 50 miles to Chico for the basketball game and should have been home at around 11 p.m. When she checked his room and found the bed untouched, that unsettling concern turned into a sinking sensation. She called Juanita, who had already been awake for hours, then Melba Madruga, but Bill and Jack weren't home either. She called Jackie Hewitt's mother, but no Jackie. She even sent her daughter-in-law down the street to speak with Gary Mathias' stepfather. But Gary was missing too. Still, the families tried to rationalize what felt impossible. Maybe they had gotten sidetracked after the game. Maybe the Montego had broken down somewhere along the highway. Maybe they had decided to stay overnight somewhere and would walk through the door any minute, embarrassed for worrying everyone. But by sunrise on February 25th, coincidence no longer felt plausible. All five were gone. Saturday passed without the boys and without answers. There were no calls, no sightings, and no explanations that made any sense. By 8 p.m. that evening, the families formally filed missing persons reports. The Yuba County Sheriff's Department issued a public alert that included a description of Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego and its license plate number. Even so, law enforcement didn't immediately launch a large-scale search. According to a 1978 Sacramento Bee article, authorities were simply watching and keeping an eye out. Police expressed skepticism. The men were adults, officers noted, and adults sometimes choose to go elsewhere. The families insisted, however, that this behavior was entirely out of character. These were 5 young men, 4 with intellectual disabilities and 1 who relied on daily medication to manage his schizophrenia, all of whom depended on routine and were not known to stray from it willingly. If something had happened, investigators initially assumed it must have occurred along the drive home. The most direct route between Chico and Yuba City runs along Highway 99, a straightforward stretch that carries you directly south. If the Montego had broken down, it should have been somewhere along that highway. Searches extended to Highway 99, Highway 70, and nearby connecting roads, but they found nothing. Police were able to confirm only a few solid details. The men had attended the Chico State basketball game. Their team had won. Their last confirmed sighting placed them at Bears Market in Chico, California, just before 10 p.m., where the clerk remembered them clearly because she was actually preparing to close up for the night and felt irritated when 5 customers arrived at the door at the end of her shift. In her words, the men were, quote, all over the place, end quote. Something struck her as slightly off, but not threatening, and nothing stood out beyond what she understood to be their disabilities. They purchased junk food, 2 Pepsis, several pints of milk, and then left. After that, there was no confirmed trail. That is until February 27th, when investigators get their first real lead. For days, investigators searched along highways, flat roads, and the logical routes between Chico and Yuba City. The issue is, the highway from Chico to Yuba City is a straight shot, so the five shouldn't have turned off anywhere on their way home. If something had gone wrong, it should have happened somewhere along that familiar stretch of road. Then, a forest ranger named Burris revisited a sighting that had initially seemed unimportant. A local resident, Mr. Neal, had reported seeing a car around 9 a.m. on Saturday along the Oroville-Quincy Highway in Plumas National Forest. At the time, no one thought twice about it. Unattended vehicles were common in that area. People drove up to ski, to snowboard, to hike into the backcountry, and left their cars there hours at a time. Burris himself had even noticed the vehicle and moved on. It wasn't until the missing persons bulletin began circulating that the significance of that sighting came into focus. The vehicle being described was a 1969 turquoise and white Mercury Montego coupe. It was Jack Madruga's car. The Montego was located deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, roughly 10 miles into Plumas National Forest, just north of Rogers Cow Camp and near what had once been a small community called Merrimack. It sat along an old stagecoach route at approximately 4,400 feet in elevation. In 1978, the road leading there was unpaved, poorly maintained, deeply rutted, and full of potholes. It was covered in 10 to 18 inches of snow. The car rested just inside the snow line, about 200 yards in. Beyond that point, snow accumulated heavily, 6 to 8 feet in places. The drive from Chico to Yuba City is flat and straightforward, so this was not simply a minor wrong turn. It was more than 2 hours in the opposite direction into mountain terrain in the middle of winter. There was no practical reason for them to be out there. So when investigators examined the Montego, what they found only deepened the mystery. The vehicle was found unlocked and the keys were missing. Inside, it looked like the end of a normal night. Candy wrappers, soda bottles, milk cartons, the remains of their convenience store stop in Chico. There was also a folded road map of Northern California and a scorecard from the basketball game. The 4 maps the men had brought that night were neatly folded inside the glove compartment. One of those maps even included the exact region where the car was now found. Outside the vehicle, there were tracks in multiple directions along the roadside, but none formed a clear path. Trails seemed to fade out or circle back, offering no definitive direction of travel. The Montego was stuck in the snow, but not buried. It wasn't nose down in a ditch or wedged into a snowbank. It appeared as though the tires had spun and lost traction. 5 adult men, each nearly 6 feet tall and close to 200 pounds, could likely have pushed it free, yet there were no obvious push marks. No visible attempt to dig it out, no clear footprints suggesting sustained effort around the vehicle. There was still a quarter tank of gas in the car. Deputies were able to hotwire it and the engine started immediately. There was no mechanical failure, no empty tank, nothing that forced them to abandon it. Investigators also expected to find significant damage underneath. The road was uneven and unpredictable, the kind of terrain that could easily tear the bottom out of a vehicle if driven at night at any speed. Deputy Lance Ayers later stated that navigating that road in the dark should have caused substantial damage to the undercarriage of the car. Yet, the Montego's undercarriage showed no significant damage at all. Even the vehicles driven up by deputies and Forest Service personnel sustained scraping on the way in. That left investigators with an uncomfortable conclusion. Whoever drove the Montego up there did so either with extreme caution or with deep familiarity with the road. They would have needed to know where the worst ruts were, where to slow down, how to angle the wheels, and they would have had to do it in the dark. But Jack Madruga was driving that night. The Montego was his pride and joy, and he was known for never letting anyone else get behind the wheel. He once refused to drive a friend home because the road was too bumpy. He was known as an exceptionally careful driver, careful enough that choosing that road in the first place seemed unlikely. His parents said that he didn't know that area at all, and to make matters worse, and even more unsettling, he absolutely disliked the cold and even the outdoors in general. So if Jack didn't know the road and he wouldn't let anyone else drive, how did his car end up 10 miles into forest terrain without so much as a scratch underneath? At first, investigators considered the simplest explanation, that the men had taken a wrong turn and become lost. But almost immediately, that theory began to unravel under closer scrutiny. They had 4 maps with them. One included the exact region where the car was later discovered. All were neatly folded and placed back in the glove compartment. If they were lost, why not use them? And the snow alone would have been an immediate signal that they were nowhere near the flat, clear highway between Chico and Yuba City. That drive doesn't involve mountain roads or winter-bound elevations. Another possibility emerged. Perhaps they went there intentionally, using the maps to guide them. But that raised an even more difficult question. Why? There were no immediate signs of violence, no broken glass, no blood, no obvious struggle, no bodies, no clear trail leading away from the vehicle. So, with that, search efforts began immediately. Forest Service rangers joined in, those most familiar with the terrain. Helicopters swept overhead, search dogs were deployed, ATVs navigated accessible sections. Teams moved through the forest on foot. In some areas, only horseback units could pass. For 5 straight days, they searched. Then, a storm moved in. 9 inches of fresh snow fell, erasing whatever tracks might have existed. Snowdrifts rose as high as 15 feet in places. Even trained search teams experienced close calls navigating the terrain. The outlook grew more grim every day that passed by, with no answers as to what happened to the 5. If the men were still somewhere in that forest, dressed as they had been that night, survival was unlikely. And if they had succumbed to exposure, searchers believed they should have been found. That was when investigators began to reconsider a theory they had initially been hesitant to entertain. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe someone had led them there. Families and law enforcement began to consider the possibility that someone else had been involved. Perhaps another driver, someone familiar with that road who could account for both the careful navigation and the strange detour into the mountains. A theory gradually took shape. What if the men had stopped to help someone? They were known to be kind and well-meaning, and their families explained that under stress, they could become confused, more suggestible, and more vulnerable. In the wrong situation, they might have trusted the wrong person or made decisions that didn't make sense to outsiders. A reward was announced for $1,215 for their safe return, and the bulletin spread across the region. Soon after, sightings began to trickle in. As investigators combed through the forest and the days stretched on without answers, a call came in from a man who may have been the last person to see the Yuba County 5 alive. 55-year-old Joseph Shones was driving up a snowy, perilous mountain road to check out the skiing conditions at his vacation trailer when his car became stuck in the snow. As he tried to free it, a sudden tightness and sharp pain gripped his chest, and he believed he was having a heart attack. He climbed back into his vehicle, left the engine running with the heat on, reclined his seat, and waited there for hours. 5 hours passed with nothing but the low hum of the engine and the wind pressing through the trees. Then, sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, as he lay in the driver's seat listening to the hollow quiet of the mountain, he heard it. A whistle. At first, it was faint, almost misplaced in the cold air. Then, it came again, clearer this time. Not wind, not an animal. It was human. Someone was whistling somewhere nearby in the dark. He slowly lifted his head and looked through the rear windshield, peering through the frozen glass. He switched on the wipers to clear the thin layer of moisture and snow, then focused down the road behind him. About 20 feet away, headlights appeared, cutting across the snow. In their glow, he could make out figures, a small group of people standing together and what looked like a woman holding a baby against her chest. Relief rushed through him, nearly overpowering the pain in his chest. Without fully processing what he was seeing, he pushed the car door open. The cold hit him hard as his boots sank into the snow. He raised his arms and called out for help. For a split second, it felt like rescue. Then, the headlights snapped off. The whistling stopped with them, and Joseph was left standing in pitch black, the wind rolling around him. His heart pounded hard enough to blur his vision, the pain in his chest intensifying as the engine idled faintly behind him. Moments later, deeper in the trees, thin beams of flashlights began to move. narrow streaks weaving slowly between the trunks. He called out again, louder this time, desperation breaking through. One by one, the beams slipped away as if whoever held them had turned and walked farther into the mountain, leaving him alone on the dark, snowy road. He climbed back into his car, shaken and helpless. Whoever had been out there had no intention of helping him. When the engine finally sputtered and died, Joseph knew he couldn't stay any longer. Sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., with no heat and no fuel left, he stepped back into the freezing dark and began walking down the mountain alone. Mile after mile in the pitch black, he made his way through the cold until 8 miles later when he reached a place called the Mountain House, where he was finally able to get help. When police first heard his account, they were skeptical. A man stranded on a snowy mountain road late at night in the middle of a heart attack, claiming he saw a group of people and a woman with a baby who refused to help him. It was difficult to accept at face value, let alone connect to the disappearance of the 5 missing men. But that skepticism began to shift when Joseph added one more detail. As he walked down the mountain, near the same stretch of road where he had heard the whistling and seen the lights, he passed an empty vehicle lodged in the snow. He described it as none other than a 1969 turquoise and white Mercury Montego. It was the same type of car the 5 men had been driving. And yet, the car sat more than 2 hours in the wrong direction in the exact place Joe had described. Around the same time, additional sightings began to surface. In Oroville, a woman named Sheila Brandon reported seeing 2 of the men, specifically Gary Mathias and possibly Jack Hewitt, enter the Russell Inn motel asking for odd jobs. She stated that they appeared on the 28th and again on the 2nd. In Brownsville, a woman named Carol Waltz said she saw Hewitt and Mathias at a local shop. According to her, the men purchased burritos, chocolate milk, and sodas, items similar to what they had bought at Bear's Market the night they disappeared. Another woman who had been in the store that Sunday believed she saw 4 of the 5 men. She was unsure about Gary. She remembered a man wearing glasses, but she couldn't describe him clearly. When shown photographs, she identified Hewitt and Madruga near a phone booth, Hewitt inside it making a phone call, and Wire and Sterling standing in the parking lot. According to her, they were driving a red pickup truck. That detail stood out because in one of his earlier accounts, Shones had mentioned possibly seeing a rust-colored pickup truck behind the Montego that night, a detail he later walked back only to reaffirm again during subsequent interviews. At that point, investigators were looking at 2 red pickup truck sightings, 1 confirmed sighting of the Montego, and multiple alleged sightings of the men. But after these initial sightings, however, the trail seemed to disappear again. Investigators were left with persistent questions. How had the men gotten up that mountain? If they left the Montego there, how had they gotten back down? And where had a red pickup truck entered the picture? As weeks turned into months, reported sightings expanded outward. Sacramento, Ontario, even Tampa, Florida, but none were substantiated. During this time, a woman in Yuba City named Debbie, who had no connection to the men, began receiving unsettling phone calls. A man told her, "I know where the missing 5 men are," before hanging up. The following day, he called again and said, "I need help because I really hurt those guys bad." When she pressed him, he told her not to play dumb and ended the call. On a third call, he stated, "Those 5 guys are all dead." He never called again. It became one more lead among many, pulling investigators in different directions. Police also explored a connection to Forbstown, where Gary Mathias had once had friends. Forbstown sits roughly halfway between Chico and Yuba City, and the road leading to it is easy to miss. If someone had passed the turn in the dark, they could continue north toward the mountains and Plumas National Forest without realizing it. Investigators considered whether the men had intended to visit Gary's friends and accidentally missed the turn. When officers contacted those friends, however, they said they hadn't seen or heard from Gary in over a year and were certainly not expecting him that night. So that possibility faded. As months passed with no clear answers, the investigation widened further. Deputy Lance Ayers, who had known some of the men from high school, pursued every possible avenue, even the unconventional ones. He consulted psychics and even a water witcher. One psychic told him that the men had been murdered inside a 2-story red house in Oroville, numbered either 4723 or 4753. Ayers took the claim seriously enough to check. He drove through Oroville, scanning streets for any two-story red houses that matched those numbers, but no such house existed. The water witcher he consulted used a Y-shaped stick, traditionally for locating groundwater, but claimed he could tune it to detect human remains. He led investigators to an empty cabin near where the Montego had been found. Nearby, they discovered a gray cigarette lighter, but none of the 5 men carried a lighter, and nothing else came of that lead. By spring, search efforts had surpassed 6,000 hours, and still, there were no definitive answers. Then, in early June, the weather began to shift and the snow in Plumas National Forest started to melt. On Sunday, June 4th, more than 3 months after the disappearance, police received a call. A group of motorcyclists riding through the Sierra Nevada mountains, approximately 20 miles from where the Montego had been located, had come across a Forest Service trailer. One of its windows was broken, and as they approached, they noticed a strong, foul odor coming from inside. They looked through the opening, and what they saw would become one of California's most enduring mysteries. The forest trailer itself sat about 1 mile west of Daniel Zink Campground, roughly 1.5 miles south of the Oroville-Quincy Highway, and approximately 20 miles from where the Montego had been found. It was accessible only by unmarked gravel roads, routes unfamiliar even to seasoned search teams. Despite extensive search efforts by 3 county sheriff's departments and search and rescue crews, this particular area had never been searched. It was considered too far from the car and just too inaccessible. Investigators had believed no one could have reached that area in those winter conditions. The route required traveling uphill, then splitting off and descending roughly 1,200 feet before climbing back up again, each step carrying a person deeper into the mountains. Inside the trailer was the emaciated body of 32-year-old Ted Wire. Ted was fully clothed and wrapped in approximately 8 layers of bedding, with his arms crossed over his chest. His belongings had been placed neatly on a table beside him. Nearby sat a partially melted candle and a gold Waltham wristwatch missing its crystal, a watch that didn't belong to Ted. When he disappeared, Ted stood at 5'11" and weighed around 200 pounds, but by the time he was found, he had lost roughly 80 pounds and his body had withered to somewhere between 100 and 120 pounds. His pants were rolled above his knees, his legs showed clear signs of gangrene, and he was missing 5 toes, lost to frostbite. A pathologist later estimated, based on his beard growth, that Ted had likely survived inside the trailer anywhere between 8 to 13 weeks. In the most extreme estimate, he may have been alive as recently as 10 days before he was discovered. The cold temperatures made it impossible to determine an exact date of death. The official cause of death was exposure, though some uncertainty remains as to whether infection from gangrene also contributed. What investigators found in and outside the trailer complicated everything. Outside sat a propane tank capable of providing heat. Inside were items that could have been burned for warmth. Wooden furniture, paperback books, but none of it had been used. Only 1 candle had been burned. The food inside the trailer raised even more questions. 31 cans had been opened and eaten, and all of them taken from a storage locker outside the trailer. Yet, right beside the locker was a second one containing enough food to feed all 5 men for an entire year, completely stocked and unopened. Ted ultimately died from starvation and freezing inside a shelter where heat and food were both within reach. Investigators also began to believe Ted likely had not been alone the entire time for a few reasons. First, the bedding. There were at least 8 layers of blankets and sheets that had been wrapped and layered carefully around Ted, his arms folded across his chest beneath them. Given his physical condition, the frostbite, the gangrene, positioning himself that way would have been nearly impossible. Second, Gary Mathias's tennis shoes were found inside the trailer, yet Gary himself was nowhere to be found. Ted's shoes, meanwhile, were missing. One theory suggests that if Gary had developed frostbite and swelling, he may have taken Ted's larger shoes in order to keep moving, but that remains speculation. Third, the can opener. 31 cans had been opened using a military-issued P-38 can opener. Police believed only Jack Madruga or Gary Mathias, both Army veterans, would likely know how to use it. That detail suggested at least one of them had been inside the trailer at some point. There were no tracks left in the snow to clarify when anyone arrived or left, but the trailer had now become the focal point of the investigation. And as search teams widened their efforts around it, more answers began to surface the following day. Along an access road leading toward the trailer, a road the men should not have even known existed, the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were discovered about 4.5 miles from the trailer. Investigators believed they likely died before ever reaching it, less than 5 miles short. One may have collapsed first, the other may have stayed beside him. Both ultimately succumbed to exposure. Jack Madruga was found face up, partially scavenged, and missing his right arm. He was still wearing a watch, and the car keys remained in his pocket. In one account, he was clasping his watch in his left hand. His body had been dragged toward or into a stream by animals. His cause of death was determined to be hypothermia and exposure. Bill Sterling's remains were largely skeletal due to extensive scavenging. His bones had been scattered across the forest floor. He was initially identified by a photograph of his sister's found in his wallet and later confirmed through dental records. Due to decomposition, an exact cause of death could not be conclusively determined, though exposure was considered likely. The two men had been inseparable in life, and investigators believe they likely remained together in their final hours. Now, only Jackie Hewitt and Gary Mathias remained missing. Jackie's father insisted on joining the search. Police cautioned him against it, but by then the operation had shifted from rescue to recovery, so he went anyway to look for his son. Now, this next part of the discovery is quite graphic and very upsetting, so listener discretion is advised. Please take care while listening. On June 7th, along the service road leading toward the trailer, searchers located Jackie's jacket along with his jeans and shoes. It was his father who bent down and lifted the jacket. When he did, Jackie's spine came with it and fell to the ground. I can't even imagine how impossible it is to put into words what that moment meant. No parent should ever have to discover their child that way. Time, weather, and wildlife had scattered what remained of Jackie across that stretch of mountain. The following day, his skull was found roughly 100 yards away. His remains lay between the trailer and the place where Jack and Bill had been discovered. Separately, about a quarter mile from the trailer in a different direction, searchers located 3 wool Forest Service blankets and a flashlight. By this point, 4 of the 5 men had been found. Only one remained unaccounted for, Gary Mathias. His tennis shoes were found inside the trailer. The opened cans suggested that at least one Army-trained individual had used the P-38 can opener, and the blankets and flashlight had been discovered leading away from the trailer. There were no confirmed remains, no verified sightings, no clear direction of travel. It had been 15 weeks since Gary's last known dose of antipsychotic medication. So the question is, where exactly is Gary Mathias? After the trailer was processed and the other 4 men were recovered, the search didn't immediately end. Teams continued working outward, still looking for Gary Mathias. They concentrated on the area surrounding the trailer and the direction where the wool blankets and flashlight had been found, hoping those items marked a path of travel. According to reporting cited by investigators, including coverage in the Lodi News Centennial, searchers believed at one point they detected the smell of decomposition in the area. Though they searched for its source, they couldn't locate anything definitive. Weeks passed with no confirmed trace of Gary. Police circulated Gary's description to psychiatric institutions throughout the region. He hadn't taken his medication with him when he left for the basketball game, so if he were alive, investigators believed he would eventually require medical care or even seek treatment on his own. But no institution reported contact with him. On June 19th, authorities officially suspended the active search. Gary Mathias became the only one who never turned up, alive or deceased. A lingering controversy in the case involves the Forest Service trailer itself. Law enforcement later stated that they were unaware of the trailer when the initial search began, while Forest Service officials cited in a June 1978 Marysville Appeal Democrat article suggested the structure was known. The discrepancy, however, was never clearly resolved. The geography in the surrounding area complicates this issue even further. The trailer was roughly 20 miles from where the Montego had been found. That distance alone may have placed it outside the original search radius. One officer, quoted years later in the Democrat and Chronicle, stated that under those winter conditions, it would have taken at least a full night and another day to travel that far on foot. That's interesting though, because the men weren't dressed for a winter trek. They only had on light jackets and were wearing sneakers. A storm moved through that night, and snowfall would have covered or erased tracks before investigators could follow a trail with any certainty. The trailer wasn't located through strategy or mapping. It was found by chance, months later, when a group of motorcyclists happened upon it. As investigators reconstructed events, they could confirm only one fact with certainty. Ted Wire made it to the trailer. His body was found inside. Based on the locations of the other remains and the physical evidence, investigators believed a larger group likely reached it as well. Early on, it was considered possible that all 5 men made it to the trailer and that some left afterward, but as more evidence surfaced, that working theory narrowed. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were believed to have died on the way, likely never reaching the trailer. Jackie Hewitt, Gary Mathias, and Ted Wire were thought to have made it there. Whether Jackie died before reaching it or after leaving remained debated, but investigators leaned toward him having arrived based on where his remains were discovered in relation to Jack and Bill. Gary's name, however, pulls the case slightly off balance. Unlike the other 4, Gary didn't have an intellectual disability. He had schizophrenia, but he had been considered stable for the 2 years leading up to the disappearance. Even before the men went missing, some family members of the others had expressed unease about Gary being a part of the group. That concern intensified after the recoveries. Ted was found, Jack was found, Bill was found, Jackie was found. Gary was not. He was the only one with a documented history of violent episodes, the only one who had demonstrated extreme survival ability in the past, and the only one who could plausibly outlast the others, physically and psychologically in a crisis. The version of Gary that existed before his 2 stable years is important context. His first psychiatric hospitalization occurred in high school, described by his parents as a bad trip. While stationed in Germany during his army service, he used drugs heavily and got into trouble. After getting discharged, his struggles continued. Heavy drug use, periods of not taking medication, relapses into psychosis, and repeated hospitalizations. He had a police record and was charged twice with assault. In 1973, he punched a police sergeant. Months later, he groped his cousin's wife. In one incident, he broke into a home and the couple woke to find him standing in their bedroom claiming he was searching for a ring to return to Satan. He also escaped psychiatric hospitals 3 times. According to reporting from the Sacramento Bee, Gary walked from Portland, Oregon, back to Yuba County, approximately 540 miles, surviving along the way by taking milk from porches and eating whatever he could find, even dog food. Whether or not Gary was involved in any wrongdoing in the mountains, families and investigators understood one thing. He was a stronger, more dominant personality within the group and potentially the only one capable of surviving alone for any extended period of time. But before asking what happened in the mountains, the more basic question remains: how did they get there at all? Well, to reach the Montego's location near Rogers Cow Camp after leaving Chico, a specific sequence of turns had to occur. They would have left Chico on Route 99, which would normally take them directly toward Yuba City. Instead, they exited 99 and merged onto Route 70. From there, they turned east onto Route 162, which becomes the Oroville-Quincy Highway as it climbs into Plumas National Forest. They would have passed out of Oroville and continued north into the mountains, driving roughly 30 miles into increasingly remote terrain. The final 6 or 7 miles were completely unpaved at that time. All of that would have occurred while every person in the car knew they were supposed to be heading home on a straight, flat, familiar highway. Joseph Schoen's timeline adds another layer to this story. If his account is accurate, he encountered either the men or someone near their vehicle at around 11:30 p.m. on February 24th, roughly 90 minutes after they were last seen leaving Chico. If the Montego reached Rogers Cow Camp in about 90 minutes, that suggests relatively fast travel, which complicates the theory that the car was driven slowly enough to avoid undercarriage damage. Even if Schoens was mistaken about details, the Montego was confirmed to be at that location by 9 a.m. Saturday when Mr. Neal reported seeing it. That allows more time for cautious driving. Yet, the lack of undercarriage damage remains difficult to reconcile given the darkness, the winter road conditions, and Jack Madruga's unfamiliarity with the area. But again, we're back to square one because the central problem persists. Why take that road at all? Police could never prove foul play, but they couldn't eliminate it either. Families, however, had their own suspicions. Ted's sister-in-law wondered if the men had seen something at the game or in the parking lot, something they weren't meant to see, and were chased. Jack Madruga's mother believed a third party was involved, someone capable of controlling all 5 men at once. She was quoted as saying, "We know good and well somebody made them do it." Investigators were left with questions they couldn't answer but also couldn't ignore. Were they chased or followed up the mountain? Why abandon a working car and head uphill into worsening snow and storm conditions? What was Schoen's hearing, the whistling, the figures he described? Why did Ted die inside a trailer with heat potential and food nearby? Who was with him, and why is Gary the only one never found? One theory raised in reporting, including coverage in the Sacramento Bee, suggested that Gary may have intentionally skipped medication that day. Not necessarily out of recklessness, but possibly to avoid side effects that might slow him down for the tournament the next morning. If that were the case, it raises the possibility that Gary could have been entering early paranoia or psychosis that night. In that state, he might have believed he needed to get away from something or reach something. He could have been hearing or seeing threats that weren't there. Given the group dynamic, his friends may not have had the capacity or even the confidence to challenge him. If Gary insisted on a direction, they may have simply followed. That possibility offers one explanation for how they ended up in the mountains, why they continued deeper into worsening weather, and why someone capable and decisive may have been the one opening cans, locating food lockers, and functioning inside the trailer. It also presents one explanation for Gary's disappearance. After days at the trailer, he could have left to find help or flee something he believed was threatening and never returned. It's a plausible scenario, but it doesn't account for everything. In a case this fractured, Gary Mathias inevitably becomes the center of gravity because he sits at the intersection of every unanswered question. He was the only one without an intellectual disability. He had demonstrated extraordinary survival ability in the past, and he is the only one whose body was never found. There is no evidence, however, that Gary survived what killed the others. There is also no proof that he died in those woods. That absence leaves him feeling like a missing page in the middle of the story. But over time, most of those officially involved, along with the families, reached the same bleak conclusion. Gary likely died in the forest, even if his remains were never recovered. By June 19th, when the search was officially suspended, investigators were left with evidence, but no single narrative that fully fit. They couldn't prove the men were chased. They couldn't prove Gary was responsible. They couldn't prove anyone else was involved. What they had instead were fragments. A route that makes little sense, a car abandoned on a mountain road leading away from Yuba City, a trailer stocked with supplies that went largely untouched, a survival window stretching across weeks, and one final missing man whose absence may just tie every question together. Even with the car located, the trailer found, and 4 of the 5 men accounted for, the story still resists a clean explanation. The facts are there, but they don't settle into something that feels complete. Certain details continue to catch. Joseph Schoen's account is one of them. The whistling he heard while stranded on that mountain road, the figures he believed he saw in the headlights, a cluster of people, and what looked like a woman holding a baby. Then, the later reports of a red pickup truck, and above all, the condition of the Montego itself. No meaningful undercarriage damage despite the terrain, despite the snow, despite the darkness. No one in that car was known to be familiar with that road. Something I didn't mention earlier was that the driver's side window of the Montego was found rolled down. By all accounts, Jack Madruga was careful with this car. Remember, this was his pride and joy, his baby. Leaving the window down in that environment would have been unusual. This could suggest the guys had interaction with someone outside the vehicle. It's certainly not proof of anything, but it shifts the scene from accident to potential encounter. When those pieces are laid side by side, they circle the same uneasy possibility. Someone else may have been out there that night. If Schoen's was correct that a pickup truck was near the Montego, one possible scenario could begin there. Someone comes across the men stuck in the snow, they offer the group a ride, and they leave the car behind. That would explain the lowered window. It would explain why the group abandoned a vehicle that could have been pushed free. It would explain why the tracks in the snow failed to tell a coherent story afterward. But it collides with an obvious question. If a good Samaritan brought them somewhere safe, that person would have likely have come forward once the search widened and a reward was announced. Which leaves a darker version of the same idea. Someone picked them up and drove them farther into the mountains. If that happened, Gary would have had enough reasoning ability and enough lived experience to understand that you don't climb deeper into the mountains to find help. Whether through logic or through paranoia, he might have sensed danger early on, and in that version of events, the group could have seized a chance to get out roughly a few miles from where the Montego was later found. They would have landed near a forest road and moved downhill toward the Forest Service trailer. The other possibility is that they believed they were being chased. That panic could explain how they ended up so far from the highway. But the car itself complicates that theory. Remember, Deputy Ayers noted that driving Oroville-Quincy Road at night at any real speed should have torn up the undercarriage. The Montego showed no such damage. If they had been fleeing recklessly, the vehicle would have reflected it. Instead, the clean undercarriage points to careful navigation or someone who knew that road. Either way, the likely path after the car would look similar. Uphill for several miles following snowcat tracks, then turning and descending toward the trailer. And once they reach the trailer, the logic fractures yet again. The trailer was stocked with butane capable of heating it throughout the winter, along with a year's supply of food and water, medical supplies, heavy clothing, blankets, matches, paper, and firewood. Yet, most of those supplies were left untouched. So the questions shift. Why not activate the butane heat? Why not open the main food locker? Why not change into heavier clothing? Why not build a fire? One explanation raised is fear. If they believed someone might still be nearby, or if Gary believed that, they might have avoided smoke, exhaust, or light that could draw attention. Ted survived for at least 8 weeks. Given his condition and his lack of strong self-preservation instincts, combined with the gangrene in his feet, he could not have managed that alone. He would not have been able to move easily, fetch water consistently, or even care for himself over that span. Someone had to have been there with him for weeks, feeding him, bringing him water, and ultimately wrapping him in the 8 layers of bedding that he was found in. Some argue Jackie never reached the trailer, so if he didn't, then it would have been Gary who kept Ted alive. But if they both made it to the trailer, then a sequence that fits the known evidence might look like this. Ted, Gary, and Jackie make it to the trailer. Gary, the most capable of navigating complex steps, gains entry. The 31C ration suggests someone familiar with military-issued can openers was involved. Gary may have set foot out in a way that required minimal problem-solving for Jackie. He may have taken Ted's boots because his own sneakers were inadequate for snow. Gary could have left to seek help, heading northeast toward areas like Buck Lake, roughly 5 miles away, and expecting to be gone for only a few days. For reasons unknown, he never reached help and never returned. Ted and Jackie remained at the trailer. The rations dwindled. The larger locker stayed closed. Jackie, believing help was imminent, may not have thought to open it. It is possible Jackie stayed at the trailer until Ted became unresponsive, then left in search of help, but tragically didn't make it far before succumbing to the elements. In that structure, what happens after the car is tragic, but at least somewhat explainable. The group attempts to reach the trailer. Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga never make it. Gary, Ted, and Jackie do. Gary leaves to seek help and never returns, leaving Ted and Jackie to endure the cold alone and eventually succumb to starvation and exposure. It's a sequence that can be arranged into coherence, but even if those pieces fit, the most destabilizing question still waits at the beginning. Why were they off course at all? Well, when the noise is stripped away, the case narrows to a short list. They left the car because someone interacted with them, possibly connected to a pickup truck. Or they left because they believed they were running from something. Or they left because Gary, for reasons that can't be proven, guided the group into a decision they didn't have the capacity to challenge. And the trailer sharpens the stakes. Someone kept Ted alive, someone opened those rations, someone got them inside, and someone, most likely Gary, walked away and was never seen again. Every theory in this case eventually circles back to the same obstacle, the Montego sitting on that mountain road. Because once you accept that single fact, everything else begins to splinter. If the 5 men drove the car up there themselves, then at some point they made a decision not to turn around. Not once. Not when the highway changed, not when the road narrowed, not when the snow deepened. But if they didn't drive it there on their own, then someone else did. And that possibility reshapes the entire story. One way to explain why they wouldn't turn back is fear, the idea that they were being chased. Their panic could account for the distance. It could explain how they kept going deeper into the mountains instead of retracing their route home. But that explanation collides with the condition of the car. If they were fleeing at speed over that rough, unpaved stretch of Oroville-Quincy Road, the Montego should have shown it. Yet, the vehicle was found largely intact, and so the paradox forms. If they were chased, the car should be damaged. If the car isn't damaged, maybe they weren't chased. If they weren't chased, then they had no reason to be up there at all. Everything known about that night, their excitement about the tournament, the straightforward route home, the flat highway waiting for them, suggests they would have never voluntarily chosen that road. Follow that logic far enough and it nudges toward an unsettling conclusion. They didn't put the car there and someone else did. Now, that's where the possibility of a carjacking enters the picture. Perhaps the group stops for gas or pulls over somewhere in Oroville, farther down the road from Chico. The group could have been attacked by someone to potentially steal their vehicle, but decided to take the boys along so as not to get caught right away. But why the mountains? Well, if you drive someone into winter terrain at elevation, you're betting that the environment will do the rest. Perhaps whoever took them lived up there, or perhaps it was simply the most isolated direction available. In this version of events, Joseph Shones becomes an interruption for the perpetrators. If the Montego was heading up that road under someone else's control, Shones' stranded vehicle could have created an obstacle for them. They wouldn't expect for another person to be in that area at night and during a snowstorm especially, so in that pause, there's an opening. The men, possibly led by Gary, seize that chance and run. They can't run back downhill if that's where the threat remains, so they move uphill instead, away from what they believe is behind them. Then, faced with open road versus concealment, they choose what feels safer in that moment. The snowcat tracks veering off to the right and descending eastward toward the trailer. This theory, however, doesn't prove anything. It does explain why they left Route 99, how the Montego ended up on a road they had no reason to take, why Shones saw headlights and figures, why reports of a red pickup truck keep surfacing in the background, why the group continues deeper into the mountains instead of turning around. There is, however, one detail that resists even this structure: the keys. Remember, Jack Madruga was reportedly found with his car keys in his pocket. Some have suggested that he may have had two sets, but that contradiction remains difficult and unresolved. The car was found unlocked and with the driver's side window rolled down, and his mother believed he would never willingly leave it that way. Even in the most coherent version of events, that detail is still a loose thread. And so this case remains suspended between what can be arranged into a plausible sequence and what refuses to settle. There are other theories out there as well. One suggests that this may have begun with Gary, that he experienced an episode and convinced the others that they were being chased. Another proposes a broader explanation, that the men succumbed to hypothermia after becoming disoriented and abandoning their car in a panic, possibly triggered by a mental health crisis involving Gary Mathias. But no matter the theories or explanations, this is a case that has the same unexplainable nature as Dyatlov Pass. So many possible explanations, but no matter where you look or how you position it, there's always a missing piece, a loose thread, something that doesn't quite fit the way it should. 5 young men left a basketball game on what should have been an easy drive home on a flat, straight-shot highway. Instead, they ended up beyond the snow line on a mountain road they had no reason to be on. And whatever happened between those 2 points, whether fear, force, misdirection, or something more complicated, remains unfinished. And after all of this, the beginning of the story is still the hardest to explain. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Darkly Speaking. If you want to keep up with more stories like this, make sure you're following along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast. Also, don't forget to send in your dark stories and case requests to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out our website, darklyspeakingpodcast.com. And with that, I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.